Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, thank you. I just had a video to have 2 applauses. So I'm going to HR events in the last couple of years. It's all about digitalization, robotization, artificial intelligence, gamification, blah, 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 blah. The only problem with all these things, that's not really tackling those points. It actually makes sense from the point of future of work for you who are business owners who would like to make better people-related decisions on an every day. So my goal for today is not really looking into the crystal ball and to the distant future, but looking for tomorrow, so you have certain takeaways immediately which you can take home after this talk, after this very short 15 minutes. We don't need to debate that digitalization, robotics, and all that stuff is going to be the future, is the future. Jan Donner, who was a famous Dutch chess player, has been asked at the end of 80s already that how he would beat or how he would compete with Deep Blue, IBM artificial intelligence. He said, I would bring a hammer. Basically, that's the only way to go against such technologies. Obviously, we don't want that. I think the key here is whenever you use any of these methods and ways, you always have to start with good and quality data, and that's what we have. In the past of work and the future of work, there are 2 important decisions to make: who to hire and how to develop people who are already on the bus. This talk is about predicting stuff. This is dangerous because Philip Tetlock, who was a scientist and has been looking into predictions of different scientists already from the early 80s, he said that most of the predictions are actually absolutely not coming true. If you would hire a bunch of chimpanzees to throw some pins to a dartboard, likely they would do better with actually predicting the future. So I don't want to end up with this, so I suddenly decided to change the title of this presentation, and I baptized it to the top 10 unavoidable points in the future of work. Who the hell are we? I'm from Hogan Assessments, and we just simply say we know people. We know people because in the last 30 years, we have assessed over 7 million, mostly leaders, around the globe. So we see what characteristics, what competencies people would need now in the future, and so on and so forth. And we know also funky data, like, for instance, 12% of added value is there from a good CEO. Or actually, in the first 1.5 years, 2/3 of our CEOs are going to fail for one reason or the other. We are an HR data analytics company, just to put it to these days' context. At that time, 30 years ago, nobody knew that such a thing exists now, and all the HRs talks about this. Well, we are doing it in the last 30 years, so we have already quite a good experience with this. And this slide is only a commercial break, all the data about our company. So when we would like to look into the future, we have to look into the past. This picture reminds me of 2 things. One is that we have heard already today that so many things invented by the Chinese. Guess what? Even assessment centers has been invented by Chinese, which has been perfectioned around the Second World War time by the Germans. That's one thing. So these methodology and technologies, what we use in HR, are nothing new, basically. The second thing of this picture reminds me of that evolution of humankind was always based on war. Who was winning the war? Basically stayed in the gene pool. And those situations where you had to win a war, you needed a leader. So basically leadership competency was always there and always a very crucial element of survival of tribes and these days companies. To have good enough stable personality, to have ambition, people and task focus, and some vision for the future are all those competencies which you needed even 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. So that would bring me for my first point, that basically all these tools which we are talking about these days are only tools. Always something new comes up. All the time around the humankind development, there was always something new. The key was how to use them, how to focus on them, and we always needed people who actually helped you to make that better. And the other thing is that, meanwhile, the thing that people are changing, they not really. Think about the fact that 85% of New Year's resolutions fail because change is hard, it's difficult, it's not comfortable for us. That's why it's important that we are focused on people, because we can predict some things. One of the most important element of personality prediction and personality areas, what I'm dealing with on every day, basis all around Europe and all around the globe in 65 countries in our company, is this sentence. the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. Of course, you have to be as punctual as possible. You have to look for the same circumstances of how someone behaved in certain area, and asking good questions and using other methods actually will help you to really focus on these elements. This is a very, very important area to think about when you're making your selection or development processes. This really brings me to a phenomenon which I believe is really true today, is the wrong selection of people. We are not necessarily looking into the right data set about people, or we are not necessarily using the best techniques. We still see that over 90% of the companies are making the prediction about the future of their employers based on CV or based on an unstructured interview. You know what's the correlation with the CV and a real job performance? 0.1. It's nothing. An unstructured interview is 0.2. A structured interview is 0.4. You can only go above better chance than flipping a coin when you make your leadership or people-based decisions if you use proper assessment methodologies. Then it goes up to 0.6. For all those who are not really familiar with correlation, just to give you a comparison, if you would take hypothetically a Viagra, let's put it that way, it happens sometimes, and the correlation between taking a Viagra and your job in bed is only 0.4. So actually, a good assessment with 0.6, correlation is way better than a Viagra. We can say that, absolutely. So the selection of workforce is one thing, but of course, it's much more thing to do with wrong selection of leaders from all the same competencies what I've been talking about before. If leadership selection would go in a good way, when we use the collective wisdom of people and ask Google what they think about my boss, my supervisor and manager, not necessarily the nice things are coming up. You can test it here in Latvia as well. It works the same way, by the way. And no wonder that because of all this and because of bad leadership selection, disengagement is in all-time high. 2/3 of the people actually is passive job seekers. Most of the people who are at LinkedIn are passive job seekers. Even more devastated areas, that when we interview people, 70% of them would say that they would rather take a pay cut if somebody would fire their boss. Also another one, which is even more scary, one study which has made in Baltimore and later on has been repeated in London, 12% or 15% of people were actively fantasizing about killing their own boss. So we're not necessarily focusing on the right thing. Leadership selection is focusing much on, as we call, emergence. Whoever is most visible, who has the best political connections within the company, who is praising about their own achievements, these are the guys who are usually getting into the leadership pool. And there's a 60% mismatch because we forget about those people who are effective. Those people who are most of the time invisible in the organization, but they are good leaders because in our words, leadership is all about putting a team together and maintaining it successfully with a good outcome on a long term. And those guys are sometimes invisible. There's a literature which has been forgotten already. It's been written by Jim Collins in 2001, The Good to Great. I'm sure many of you know this book. Remember what the study was found there? That basically they were looking into the profile of a couple of companies who were much better than the average on the stock exchange for numerous amount of years, and the most important differentiating factor for these companies were the person of the CEO, who was one of the most humble person in the whole organization, who was basically almost invisible. When you walked into the meeting, you wouldn't know who is the CEO because their humbleness, their focus on an effective way running a team was much more important. When we ask employees all around the globe that what actually they're looking for in leaders, there are 4 points which are coming back all the time. First thing is integrity, trustworthiness. People have to trust you. It's very obvious. Second one is competency. Competency in the industry where you. So basically what we say that the cult of MBAs are not necessarily working out in long term. Just general managerial practice will not take you anywhere. You need to know something about the business. You have to make good judgment as the third point. It doesn't mean that you always make good decisions. It means that when you made a bad decision, you acknowledge it, you ask feedback about it, so next time you can make a better judgment. And the third one, as another obvious one, is really putting up a compelling vision for the team. And guess what? Charisma is not part of any of these. So that's my number 5 point. Charismatic leadership is basically a myth. It's not going to lead you anywhere. Another important area which we need to take into consideration when we select and develop leaders is what we call the dark side of leadership. What happens to you when you are under stress, when you're bored, when you're tired? You get hired for the competencies, but most of the cases, this area is completely forgotten from the data set. And this is the result of all these guys on the screen. I would just pick one, Martin Winterkorn, who was probably the best CEO ever in the Volkswagen Group. And guess what, 2 weeks ago, because of the diesel scandal, is already under investigation. And I'm sure you have watching the news even this week, they arrested Audi's CEO. Because these guys, quite good when everything's okay, but when stress comes, they even go to the flight, fight, or freeze mode. Their behavior change. They don't see the limits anymore. They're crossing that thin red line, and they're ruining the company and other areas. Another tricky point, I've been talking about recruitment. Now it's time to focus on leadership and development on this element. I would say that roughly 66% of the budget which is allocated to training is most of the time just a waste of money. For the reason of, for instance, let's see the statistics here, which shows how much companies actually investing into leadership development. That's okay, it's rising, very nice. But on the other hand, confidence in leadership is just dropping. If somebody knows what negative correlation is, this is a poster child for that. So definitely something is not done right, because we believe that development for everyone is okay, but actually it's a lie, for 2 reasons. One of them is not everybody is coachable. If you are coachable, you need to be humble enough to acknowledge that you have weak points, that someone else knows something better, and you listen for feedback. And also you need curiosity. You have to be open for those ideas. And also when we examine people, if they fit to a certain job or not, we see low, high, and average fit people. Whoever is on high fit, there's no need to train those guys. They know it already. There are some people on the low end, some of them really low, so they're so bad, training will not help. So just think about this in the longer term. So when we talk about leaders who are creating culture, who are creating engagement, and the engagement creates profit, this is one of the most important elements which as a leader you can make as an impact on your organization. If you're trustworthy, if you're competent, if you know good judgment, and if you really have a compelling vision, people are going to trust you and work with you. Just to go back to the automation and also the robotics and all that stuff, there's a story which I heard not too long ago in London, when one company who is an excellent robotized agile process company who basically don't see anyone, everything is computerized. They look for LinkedIn. If somebody is changing something in their profile, it's likely that they're going to look for a new job. A robot sends them an email. The email is going back, then scheduling a video interview, and then the people are called for the interview to the office to meet first time a human being. But what happens? 80% of the people are not showing up. Why? They were thinking about this quite a long time, and they figured that if they insert only 5 minutes of a phone call with a human being, roughly 80% of the people will show up for the interview. So make sure that when you hear all about these new things, new technologies, there are much more things you need to take care of as housekeeping, how to make better people-related decisions, focusing on the right set of data from competency, from value, and from dark side perspective as well, making sure that you develop those who actually really need to get developed. There are a lot of things on the market right these days from agile perspective. It's like snake oil in the Western world, which they promise that they're going to cure everything. They're not. Only look for those tools which are valid, reliable, and really have a business impact on your organization. Unless otherwise, it's really not going to work out. So don't take drugs, don't take bad assessment methods, don't take bad agile tech. I'll leave you with one more point. Because sometimes we believe that we know it, and we genuinely believe that it's going to help us, but not necessarily all the time. Stephen Hawking, who just died a couple of weeks ago, said that the greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, when you ignore stuff, but when you have illusion, then you know something. So with that, I'm wishing you good entrepreneurs in the future, looking into the past all the time, because there are a lot of things we can learn from there. Exactly 15 minutes there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.